Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's installment of the Summer History Talks series. My name is Janie Adams. I'm the History Engagement Coordinator for the Arizona Historical Society. I'm a staff historian, and I'm the Associate Editor of the Journal of Arizona History. A little bit about the Arizona Historical Society before we get started. AHS is a nonprofit educational and cultural institution and a state agency, and we were established in 1864. AHS collects, preserves, and tells the stories of Arizona's past through museum exhibitions, libraries and archives, collections, outreach, educational programming, and through publications. AHS shares our past, preserves our past, shares our state stories, and connects people through the power of Arizona history. And if you like programs like this, if you want to see more programs like this, consider becoming a member of the Arizona Historical Society. Members get free admission to AHS museums, special member-only events, and member pricing for programs, print journals, print copies of the Journal of Arizona History, and so much more. And you can stay connected with us at the Arizona Historical Society, of course, by becoming a member, by signing up for our email list, following us on social media, visiting us at one of our museums, and to learn more about the Arizona Historical Society and all the things that we do, you can visit us at azhs.org today. Some reminders for today's session. So this is a Zoom webinar, so I can't hear you, Dr. Myers can't hear you. If you have questions or comments, please use the Q&A feature and type those in, and we will answer your questions at the end of the session. The next program in the summer series is going to be on August 12th with Dr. Cynthia Radding, and I will linger here for a minute if you want to snap this QR code with your smartphone. Otherwise, information for this and other programs in the series are going to be on our website, azhs.org/calendar. And if you happen to be in Tucson in a couple weeks, you can join us on the evening of August the 5th for a talk with Dr. Catherine Massoff on matrilineal business networks in Tucson. Again, here's a QR code for that. If you need more information about this program, you can get that from our website, azhs.org/calendar. All right, and let me introduce our speaker for today before I turn it over. Dr. Nicholas Myers currently works as a historian with the National Trails Office, a division of the National Park Service in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He earned a PhD from Cornell, where he studied the history of Latin America, the U.S. West, and the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. And his research has been supported by the Social Science Research Council, the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard University, and the Clements Center for Southwest Studies at Southern Methodist University. Dr. Myers, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Cool. Are we ready?
Yep.
All right. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Let me just share my screen here. Is this working? Does it look good?
It's queuing up. It's going. There it goes.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. Well, so I want to say thank you. Let me start by saying thank you to Janie and to David Turpey of the Arizona Historical Society and everyone involved with the society for putting this together and for having me. This is a real pleasure. So I appreciate all their work, and I appreciate all of you for being here. So let me just say I'm going to diverge a tiny bit from the sort of from the topic that I had originally given. I will tell this story, and that's essentially what it was, right? A kind of story about this royal visita by a Spanish official to the Sonoran frontier and what he found there. But I kind of decided, I think, unfortunately for my own sleep schedule, that I really wanted to take this opportunity to unfold this story into a larger argument that I'd like to make in a paper at some point in the future. Um, so without further ado, right? Rationality, brutality, insanity, the Visita General to the Sonoran frontier, and I'd add and its relationship with the contemporary U.S. border. So this argument here that I would like to make is really about a kind of notable concurrence between an 18th century geopolitical development associated with the Bourbon reforms in northern New Spain and the location of the contemporary U.S. border. And I think the main question that comes up, the essential question here, is how the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which more or less established the contemporary border, is related to the conception and formation of a quote line of presidios, right? Those being sort of Spanish military installations in northern New Spain in 1772. This question sort of came to me in a lot of ways. Sorry, kind of having trouble advancing the PowerPoint here. There we go. Because I had noticed, and I think I'm certainly far from the only one that has noticed or that would have noticed this incredible concurrence between the distribution of these Spanish presidios, right, which sort of concluded in the late Bourbon era, like basically before the turn of the 19th century. There was some movement after that, but they were largely established at that point. And the location of the contemporary U.S.-Mexico border. I mean, if you look at this map, you can see these sort of, and I would call your attention in particular to the squares and triangles here, which date from 1768 to 1821. So, you know, roughly the what we call the late colonial period. And these are built, I mean, the concurrence is incredible, right? They're kind of exactly along the contemporary border. Many of them, you know, some are a little over, some are a little under. You'll notice in your area, in the kind of southern Arizona vicinity, you have some that are north of the, a few kind of notable exceptions, including Tucson, that are north of the border. But those actually are part of, I think two of the three were located within the Gadsden Purchase, which was, of course, a territorial acquisition that happened a little later after 1848 in 1852. And for the uninitiated, I'll just give a basic premise here, right? That a huge portion of northwestern Mexico, in what I think is rightly described as an act of territorial aggression, was sort of seized by the United States and ceded via the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to the United States in the year of 1848. There was a further acquisition of territory, I believe, in 1853 with the Gadsden Purchase, specifically in southern Arizona and southern New Mexico. So again, late colonial era, a large number of Spanish forts are built. These presidios, right? These Spanish colonial forts are built roughly contiguous with today's U.S.-Mexico border. So why was this? We can look back to this map from 1769, produced by a royal engineer named Nicholas Lafora, but Lafora was actually working for a man named Marquis de Ruby, who was himself working for a man named Jose de Galvez, and Galvez had been charged with coming to New Spain and instituting you know, a series of reforms. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the change in Spanish colonial policy that halted the settlement, that created this line and halted settlement beyond that line, and thus kind of determined a distribution of the Spanish descended or Mexican or mestizo population in the 18th century, which in turn played a critical role in the negotiations between a man named Nicholas Trist, who acted on the part of the United States, and Manuel de la Peña y Peña, who was held various positions of power in the Mexican federal government at that point, and established the Mexican territorial concessions at the end of the Mexican-American War. So I know I mentioned before that, right, this is pretty easy to see this concurrence. And so I want to give a caveat here, and I think it's because the reason a lot of historians that have been, well, I'm going to speculate here and say, because drawing on my own experience, I think the reason a lot of historians have been kind of hesitant to explore this kind of concurrence between this military establishment and the contemporary border is that it does have a certain way of unfortunately like naturalizing or potentially naturalizing the US territorial acquisitions in the war. Um, that is not far from my intention at all. um, I mean, I do want to say I think this was clearly, and people can debate this, but I think I'm in agreement with most professional historians on both sides of the border when I say that this was, and Abraham Lincoln, by the way, when I say that this war was an act of territorial aggression. Um, right, there wasn't kind of any sort of natural geopolitical situation that sort of justified the actions of the United States. So I just want to be very clear about that. Um, but I think it's also interesting, right? The potential political pitfalls of discussing something like this really shouldn't, I think, necessarily be, and this is again my opinion, um, a reason to shy away from it, right? I mean, I think there is a concurrence here, and I think exploring it can be productive and fruitful, to understand broadly the history of the United States and Mexico, but certainly to understand the history of the U.S. Mexico borderlands. Um, So I want to say here too that the territorial extent of the U.S. conquest at the time that it happened, and so I'm talking about between 1846 and 1848, as the war was progressing, um, the territorial extent of the cessions by Mexico. I mean, certainly the idea that Mexico would cede any territory was not a given, um, but the extent of whatever territory was going to change hands was certainly not a given and was certainly not predetermined. Um, so what we can say is that in the United States, James K. Polk, the president at the time, and other expansionists certainly had they had already annexed Texas, right? So there was certainly the idea that Texas would remain part of the United States. What was going to be the western or southwestern border of Texas, whether that would be the Nueces River or the Rio Grande, as it is today, was certainly up for debate. They also had their eyes set on the acquisition of California, particularly the port in San Francisco, as for kind of clear reasons, right? Sea to shining sea, manifest destiny. Polk and others wanted U.S. access to the Pacific further south than Oregon. But again, right, the rest of this acquisition was kind of yet to be determined, and where the border eventually was placed was the result of negotiations between this man, Nicholas Trist, and some representatives of Peña de la Peña. Um, so we'll return to this, everything that happened kind of in the mid 19th century, but then I want to go back again to the line of presidios, right? So the line of presidios is established by a kind of royal order in 1772 by King Carlos III. Here you have a map from 1769. So what we're looking at in many ways with this Lafora map is not a kind of done deal, but an idea in process, right? Lafora made a number of really beautiful maps like this one, and this, by the way, is I apologize if it's hard to read. One of the reasons it's hard to read is the original of this map is enormous. Made a number of really beautiful maps. This is one of them. But I want to point your attention, and I'll use Arizona because this is the Arizona Historical Society. I'm sure many of you are joining us from many places, but I'll talk about Tucson and Arizona where I can. So you'll notice this red line kind of that crosses maybe the bottom third. I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but it sort of crosses the bottom third of the map. And this is labeled paralelo, o paralelo de 30 grados, right? Parallel of 30 degrees, o línea de defensa proyectada, or projected line of defense. So this was a conception that the Spanish could, in fact, create a sort of barrier, a military barrier, to separate northern New Spain or parts of northern New Spain from what was to the north of it. And so I'll point your attention to a couple of other things here, right? Which is this label up in the sort of just right of center at the top that says Provincia de Gila. Now, this wasn't an actual province in New Spain, and Gila here is referring to the Gila Apaches. And so this is a kind of clear recognition of indigenous territory. So would at the upper left, these Tierra de los Papagos, right? Another kind of mark of indigenous territory. This label, I'm very curious of. Going back to the right of the screen here, Provincia del Nataje. I have no idea what that means or who that refers to. Possibly given its location, the Jicarilla Apache, and then you see at the right extreme, Tierra de los Comanches, right? Comanche territory. So it's very clear here, I think, that you have kind of autonomous indigenous spaces to the north of this line broadly, and to the south, you have kind of largely Spanish settlements, right? Missionized, kind of colonized areas. And this is very imperfect, but I'll I'll sort of ask you to consider how imperfect this conception and this plan was on the part of these Spanish administrators, right? I mean, it's I think it bears remembering that a lot of these folks, high up in the imperial bureaucracy, are kind of global card players, right? And they're sort of moving pieces around a giant world map, and sometimes that has tremendous effects. Sometimes it's a bit of a fantasy. It's a little of both all the time. It's really hard to say where that line is. But this is a strange. Um, I mean, these were interesting folks, and I think they had interesting sort of big ideas, right? Some of them ambitious to the point of being unrealistic. But I think, as you'll see today, even when these ideas didn't achieve their sort of stated end, they could often end up having repercussions that we live with today. So let's go to the Visitador General, the royal general visitor, right? And maybe visitor is not the best translation. Probably inspector is a better one. And so that would be, here's a couple of great white-haired bourbon bourbon bureaucrats for you. We've Carlos III, the sort of bourbon king at the time, on the right, and Jose de Galvez on the left. So as this Visitador General, Galvez was really charged with coming to the Americas, to a specific portion of the Americas, New Spain, and instituting a number of reforms that we associate now with this kind of concept of bourbon reforms. And I could give those of you who are familiar probably know, you could give a whole talk, you could give a whole class on what the bourbon reforms were and what they were not, and how they manifest in different places. I think in the interest of sort of time and keeping things together here, we'll say that the bourbon reforms were really a series of kind of political and economic reforms geared towards rationalizing the administration of Spain's empire. Right, the goals were really to create more revenue for the crown, to fight, to be more competitive in this sort of increasingly global world of European competition. I mean, this is a period. And we're talking about the Visita begins in 1769. So we're talking about a period almost immediately after the end of the 7 Years' War, truly kind of global imperial war. Spain is interested in creating greater control, like creating a greater hierarchy, a more transparent hierarchy, more transparent administration, but also bringing in more revenues, right? Creating sort of rational systems to control their colonies, and to extract the greatest economic benefit from them. So this is what Galvez is tasked with. So it's really interesting. It's an interesting moment in time, right? Spain is sort of reeling from their loss, the kind of humiliating loss, including the seizure of Havana in the 7 Years' War. Carlos III is sending his sort of best and brightest out to the colonies to sort of change the way they operate. So this right in front of you is a contemporary picture of Malaga. This is where Jose de Galvez was born and grew up and began his early career. I wanted to show this. I mean, I like the contemporary photos with a bit of color. I think they give you a sense of a place a little better than some of these line drawings from the era. You may disagree with me, but this is Malaga, and I think you could see it, right, as a kind of somewhat verdant, right, seaport, a busy place. It certainly was also in the mid 18th century, a kind of important port. And this is where Galvez is born and grows up, right? Somewhat poor. He ends up studying law at Salamanca, at the great Spanish university, and he moves to Madrid eventually, where he marries a French noblewoman, He continues to make connections in the Spanish court and eventually serves as the personal attorney of Prince Carlos, who's Carlos III's son, and eventually will be Carlos IV. Galvez is a learned man, right? He's a lawyer. He's an urban person, right? His personal library. This is a great detail. Some wonderful research turned this up. His personal library contains works at the time, not just by Spanish thinkers, but by people like Denis Diderot, Rene Descartes, the Baron de Montesquieu, and even John Locke. So Galvez really a kind of man of the enlightened, right? Well-read, well-educated, a lawyer, living in big kind of urban areas. So he's tasked with this royal inspection. This is a big moment in his career. He crosses the ocean, and where does he arrive? He arrives in Veracruz, right, which would be on the sort of Gulf Coast of Mexico, on the eastern side, of course, on the Atlantic side. I wanted to show this picture because it's remarkably similar, right? And I think Galvez arrived in a New Spain that was already kind of, the built environment was very well established in many places by the 18th century. There was a bureaucracy, there was a political hierarchy. There were merchants, there were rich people and poor people. This would have been a world that actually looked very familiar to him, his first time crossing the Atlantic. But Veracruz was not all that different, right? And he follows the so-called Paso de Cortez up by the two big, beautiful volcanoes, and he drops down into Mexico City, and he begins work. And this is 1765. He's 45 years old at this point. So he begins his work in Mexico City. He imposes new taxes. He reforms the means of their collection. He establishes a state monopoly on tobacco. He reforms the customs system. The results of these efforts nearly doubled state revenue in the course of about 5 years. And he oversees the expulsion of the Jesuits from New Spain, which is no small task, right? A very contentious thing. So he has a few other missions, right? Some of these are given him by the king. Others he sort of takes on himself. Now, Galvez from very early on shows a deep interest in Sonora, which for those of you in Arizona right now, at this moment, in the late colonial New Spain, Arizona, what is today Arizona, is really sort of split between New Mexico in its sort of northern half and Sonora in its southern parts, probably considered Alta or Upper California at the time. Galvez is well aware of the tremendous amounts of silver that are coming out of the Sierra Madre and in other parts of the north of New Spain, and has a strong sense, because of discoveries, because of letters he's received, that mining potential further north, right, beyond Sonora into what is now Arizona and Southern California is quite high. And so he has a strong interest in developing this mining. It's something that produces a lot of revenue for the crown. But he also has a sense that there's something happening that's in the way, right? So this slide, by the way, this is the Marquis de Rubi. This is sort of part of the Royal Visita. The Marquis Rubi is a kind of a military engineer that's traveling with Lafora, who made the map you saw earlier. While Galvez is in Mexico City working on all these fiscal reforms, Rubi is traveling all through the north, visiting presidios, doing a sort of inspection of this northern frontier line. So good to keep in mind. We'll come back to Rubi in just a second. So what does Jose de Galvez know of Sonora, right? And this is some of the stuff that I've encountered in my own research. Kind of these are just a few examples of a lot of letters, right, that come from the north, sort of pleading for intervention, pleading for help in many ways. So I'll read these, right? 1749, Sonora has been beset by, quote, the common enemy Apache, who frequently and nearly continually invade in numerous scattered and ferocious gangs. 1754 in Nueva Vizcaya, just to the west, what is now Chihuahua and southern New Mexico, subject to, quote, the most cruel and bloody hostility carried out by barbarous enemy nations, composed of a mass that is difficult to divide without the application of extraordinary force. And I want to point your attention to that. This quote always stuck out to me. The idea that this isn't, whatever's happening in the North is not sort of limited to a single ethnicity, right? This idea of a mass that is difficult to divide without the application of extraordinary force points to really sort of two things, right? A sort of diverse group of people, but also a level of cooperation among different peoples. And then, so the last year, 1755, a prominent Sonoran, enemy Indians are causing painful devastation and leaving lands abandoned and neglected. Now, I think, again, these are colonial voices, right? And these aren't, these are letters that made their way into the Archivo de Indias in Seville. They're letters that have reached top officials. These are not peasants. They're not farmers. These are elites that are writing these letters. And I think that's important to remember because we want to take them with a grain of salt. There were a lot of advantages to being persecuted at this moment, right? There was relief from taxation granted by the crown in a lot of cases. There was simply the money to be made by a kind of expeditionary force coming up and needing to buy food from whoever controlled an hacienda in the area. And then there were certainly the advantages of a stable and controlled labor force, right? So I think I think a lot of the sort of more wealthy colonial hacendados in New Spain sort of looked at autonomous indigenous people as sort of wasted labor, right? And the idea was that the crown or the government should come and bring them into communities, force them to settle down, where they would then work in support of the economy, but also the hacienda and therefore the hacendado. So I think I would certainly draw your attention to that. I would also note here that sort of because of that, the idea of these attacks, and I don't really know, but they also could be somewhat exaggerated in terms of their hostility, right? Again, kind of trying to create the conditions for military intervention. And when I read this, I think there's a level of interaction and violence that was certainly present, that it's hard to say exactly what that was. It's something you can dig deeper into. But I think one of the things that you really can take away from this is that there are significant numbers of people and groups of people living autonomously in these areas, right? That are not under control of the Spanish crown, free to move as they want, free in some cases to act as they want. So Galvez travels to the frontier in Sonora after his very successful stint in Mexico City to confront this problem, right? To sort of bring the indigenous people of the region to heal, and then to move on from that into developing a kind of new mining sector that would even potentially move further north into largely what is now Arizona and southern portions of New Mexico, especially southwest New Mexico. Got ahead of myself. So I'm just going to read you a little chunk here, right? About this trip, right? This is actually an extract from my dissertation. But so Galvez himself traveled to the northern frontier in 1769. He had secured nearly 80,000 pesos from Spanish traders gathered in Jalapa, Veracruz, and an additional 100,000 from the royal consulate, with the blessing of the viceroy. So again, Mexico City, Jalapa, Veracruz, port cities, right? Cities that are really Mexico City is not, but cities that are integrated in a kind of big global colonial economy, right? Urban places, places that Galvez is familiar with. So he arrives at the mouth of the Rio Mayo on the Gulf of California on the 7th of May, 1769, to personally oversee a campaign directed against the Indians of Sonora. Galvez initially planned to offer the Seri O'odam and their Apache allies no quarter, only a choice of capitulation or death. Initial military efforts, however, proved entirely fruitless. Spanish forces suffered heavy losses. Pursuit of the enemy in the rugged high country, an area known as Cerro Prieto, or the Dark Hills, was a largely futile endeavor. Quote, upon seeing the instrumental strength of our arms, wrote Galvez, the enemies bet the entirety of their defense and security on the refuge provided by the vast extension and extraordinary roughness of the lands in which they have been pursued. I want to pause here for a second too, because um, yet again, the kind of moment where I think it's instructive to do a little reading through these colonial texts. Um, I mean, essentially, what's happening on the ground is that the Spanish military forces are frustrated, and they cannot directly confront these peoples that are using the land and the ruggedness of the land and certain levels of guerrilla tactics to be highly effective in evading and kind of resisting the Spanish. For Galvez, the thing to emphasize is that they're sort of running away and hiding. But I think at the end of the day, this is proving to be very effective, and I think where the story goes from here will sort of shore that up, right? So his hand forced, Galvez offered a general amnesty for those who would lay down their arms, but none did. The offer was extended a further 10 days, and then 25, and still none. In the meantime, Galvez sent one of his lieutenants, Eusebio Ventura Belena, south to Sinaloa to quell unrest on the Rio Fuerte there, so south of where he is in Sonora. When Galvez grew impatient with diplomacy, he relieved Belena of command and confined him to quarters. Right, this is where we start to see an interesting change, and again, I want you to think of Galvez as being this kind of bookish character, right? A lawyer, a kind of an urban person. Um, so Galvez then goes south himself to Sinaloa. He promises the rebels immunity if they lay down their arms, and then he orders them seized in their homes. They are executed, 20 of them, and their heads are displayed on pikes. 17 more sentenced to lashes and imprisonment. So you could sense, I mean, I don't want to brush over the brutality of this, right? I mean, this is uh, perhaps less shocking in the late 18th century than it is to us today. But this is still right. This is still Galvez sort of going back on his word, for one, violating a promise, um, and then also really kind of displaying body parts, right? Taking an additional step to sort of use fear, to use terror, right, as a tactic. And so I think in this we could say a lot about it, but I think one of the things that you can sense is an increasing frustration and a desperation, right? Um, Often the source of brutality, never an excuse for it. Um, but this act was actually followed by, interestingly, sickness. And so, from what we understand, the Visitador General, Galvez, began to experience fevers and weakness shortly thereafter. Um, the offer of amnesty rebuffed again, and this is we're back in Sonora in the north. Galvez and his lieutenants launched another campaign against the Seri and Pima into the Cerro Prieto in October of this year. Remember, he had come in May, so he's been there several months now. Again, no tangible result. The rebels eluded their pursuers. As his health continued to deteriorate, he eventually suffered, and this is wild, right? A sort of a psychotic break. And I mean, I'm no psychologist, but I kind of read this as, yeah, maybe perhaps something between a panic attack and a psychotic break. I mean, you can sort of judge for yourselves, right? So Galvez claimed to have received a letter from St. Francis of Assisi censuring his military officers that worked for him, right? Essentially assigning the blame to them for this failure, and proposing, and this again is St. Francis, that Galvez travel to Guatemala and raise an army of apes to send to the Cerro Prieto to defeat the rebels. Um, I mean, again, we could sort of linger on this, but this is I mean, the man has a breakdown. It just kind of, which is, I find fascinating, right? He's in this place. He's in a place that's strange to him, that's foreign to him. He's also somebody that's used to being very successful, right, at everything he does. And then here he finds a situation that he just simply cannot push through. Um, and what follows is kind of a mental decline. Um, so at about this moment, as the Spanish troops continue to clash with the Pima, Seri, Yaqui, and Mayo peoples in Sonora and Sinaloa, Galvez receives word of an uprising on the Gila River in New Mexico. So sort of more bad news, and then continually, or continues rather, to get word that in neighboring Nueva Vizcaya, which is today's Chihuahua, the state of Chihuahua in Mexico, more or less, that there the citizens were subject to, quote, bloody piracies and continual harassment by the Apache. Galvez sets off to sort of take care of these issues. He doesn't get far. He never makes it to New Mexico. He crosses the mountains to Nueva Vizcaya, stays there only briefly, engages in no military action, even though his troops are with him. And then, struggling with his physical and mental health, he departs southward shortly after arriving. He leaves for Chihuahua City in the spring of he departs Chihuahua City in the spring of 1770. So this is a little less than a year since he's come north, and travels back to Mexico City by carriage because he's unable to ride a horse. Galvez recovers. He never has a kind of there are no similar incidents in the rest of his life. He goes on to have a long and illustrious career. He becomes Minister of the Indies, which is a really important position. We'll talk about that just a little bit more in a second. He goes back to Mexico City and stays for another 2 years, where he continues his focus on fiscal reform. And he and this we get back to the Marquis de Rubi, who had done this inspection of the northern presidios. They sort of come back together in Mexico City at this point when Galvez returns in 1772. And the result is this kind of unimpressive looking, right? But this is reglamento e instrucción, like regulations and instructions for the presidios that are to form in a line on the frontier of New Spain, 1772. And this document has it has the name of Carlos III on it, but this is clearly the work of Galvez and Rubi, who are the ones who had both conceived of this and written it. Galvez departs New Spain in this same year and goes back to Madrid to take up his duty, or Seville rather, to take up his duties as Minister of the Indies. So he's in effect promoted. He's done, I suppose, in the eyes of the king, a good job. So we'll leave it here. I'm going to read you something the Marquis writes in a letter, right, about the kind of concept that is behind this new regulation, right? He says, and I quote, "Picture then a line stretched from the coast of the South Sea, meaning the Pacific, between the Presidio at Altar and the ruined mission at San Miguel Sonayota, at something like 30 degrees latitude, extending from the mouth of the Rio de Guadalupe in the north in the Gulf of Mexico. Said line, considered geometrically, will cut the same parallel of 30 degrees that passes through these 2 points and enclose within itself, leaving New Mexico outside for now, all that which is rightly called the dominion and true possessions of the king." I mean, I find this fascinating. Again, right? This is a kind of an extremely ambitious plan. The idea that Rubi goes on to describe the way in which a series of frontier forts, right, will be aligned across the sort of what he admittedly is the kind of northern extent of Spanish control in the north, and that by launching sort of regular patrols, these presidios and the soldiers in them will be able to impede the movement of indigenous peoples from north to south, right, and essentially keep in the colonized part and keep out the uncolonized part. And so the efficacy of this line to do that was pretty limited, right? It didn't really function in that way, and it never did. And so, in that sense, we can think of this as a failure. But I want to point you to a couple of things, right? One is that putting this into practice was an enormous investment on the part of the crown. In fact, there's in 1776, a few years later, there's a huge political reorganization which is the creation of the Provincias Internas, sort of follows along with this idea, and that change and others, right, are going to make huge changes in the sort of character of the population in the north, right? One is to fundamentally militarize northern communities, and so we'll switch back to this map. early presidios sort of functioned to protect roads, and you can sort of see, I'll ask you to look at sort of the squares and the circles towards the bottom of this map. Um, they're really protecting roads that are leading up to the silver regions in the north of Mexico. Um, they also are sort of serving as nuclei for new communities, right? So the presidios are meant to sort of early presidios at least um, to sort of be military outposts for a little while and protect the roads while they're needed. Then when they sort of grow into communities, they will support themselves. They'll no longer require investment from the crown, and they will transform into towns essentially. Um, it's sort of different in the north after this regulation of 1772. The idea of creating a line sort of means that these presidios are no longer just protecting roads for as long as they need to be protected. They're actually creating a border. Um, it's heavily militarized, so this is affecting the sort of the culture and the settlement patterns in the north. But also, and perhaps more importantly, this is just a halt, a broad halt to Spanish colonization, right? If you'll recall that, Galvez travels up to Sonora with the goal of pacifying that region to develop and extend the mining interests there. Um, he fails, right? He fails. He goes back to Mexico City. He meets with the Marquis de Ruby, and together they sort of formulate this plan that essentially says the very far north is hopeless. Right? We sort of cannot take control from the indigenous people. Um, and what we need to do is just shore up a fortified border, right? To separate the areas where we can control things from the areas where we can't. Um, and I'll point to this. So again, another little moment of Arizona history. And I won't read all this. You can read it if you want. Here's Hugo O'Connor, the Irish Spanish military, the Irish born or Dublin born Spanish military officer, um, who was appointed to a pretty prominent command position in the north shortly after this new regulation. And it was O'Connor who actually moved the Presidio from Tubac to Tucson, effectively founding that community, in keeping with the instructions given him on the regulation of 1772. So Tucson was actually founded in order to move Tubac to a place where it would be more efficacious in creating the presidial line. So this is, if you're from Southern Arizona, this is absolutely your history. Um, Great. All right, we're just gonna go back really quick, look at this map while I talk about this next point. Um, but I wanted to point out too that the area north of this line, right, was also an area that the Spanish had for some time known as La Gran Apacheria, right, the great Apache homeland. I think is probably a decent translation of that. Um, but this place was occupied not just by the Apache, and I mean, I think there are different opinions on this. But we can go back. There's a perhaps apocryphal kind of idea that the name Apache comes from the Zuni for enemy, right? And I think we can see this with a lot of the sort of colonial names for native peoples. But I think that is in some way telling in the sense that for the Spanish, particularly in this area. The term Apache is kind of a loose category. And I think it has as much to do who gets labeled as an Apache. It's not necessarily about right language or ethnicity, or it has as much to do with language and as ethnicity as it does with a kind of autonomous and or semi-nomadic life right outside the bounds of colonization and engaging in some in raiding activity, right? So it's essentially the you'll see Spanish officials use terms like barbarians and enemy Indians and Apache somewhat interchangeably. Um, because this area right north of this line is occupied of course by dozens right of indigenous groups. I mean, just in the area that is now Arizona and immediately to the south, this would be the Odam, the Pipash, the Seri, the Yaqui, the Quechan, the Mojave, Shobiapuri, Hohokam, Opata, and many more, right? um, dozens and dozens of groups in this whole area. When we think of Texas, that's a complete other like sort of indigenous geography. But this region broadly, right, was conceived of as a patria, and you can sort of find definitions of a patria that connect that sort of delineate a southern border of a patria almost along this exact same line in a way that really echoes what Ruby says. The way Ruby articulates the line, right, as the southern border of a patria being something that essentially connects the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of California. So again, right, just a kind of different way of conceiving of this line. And then also I really want you to think about this line as separating, right, in many ways, colonized space from indigenous space. All right, Marquita Ruby. So I'm going to move through the rest of this kind of quickly because we're already getting up there on time. I'll do a disservice to a lot of the things I'm going to talk about. I'm happy to answer questions about this. But here's the piece. Here's the link. We're going to move forward in time, and we're going to do this. I show you this banner of Diversion of Guadalupe, which is what the Mexican Independence Forces marched under, as a way of apologizing for doing great injustice to the Mexican period here. And I'm going to move forward to 1848, but I will say a couple of details, right? At a certain point, Spanish policy changes, and large numbers of Apache actually come and camp at these presidios, and they receive rations, really kind of changing the culture, I think, arguably in the North, creating a period of peace and kind of entrenching this line, I think, in many ways. And that is followed by by Mexican independence, where these peace establishments largely dissolve, I think, for a number of reasons. One of them being that Mexico does not have a strong central government that can continue to provide rations or support for the officers and soldiers that man the presidios. And then you do see a kind of level of extreme violence, and there's been some great historical work done about this, right? Whereas the Apache and increasingly the Comanche sort of press forward on Sonora, Chihuahua, and areas of Mexico further to the east, they're actually pushing back in some ways colonization, right? And we see a lot of people refer to these lands as being desiertos, right, which would be maybe literally translated as deserts, but they're really kind of referring to something like wasteland, like that people have left. That these places are rather than being deserts, they're deserted, right? That people have left their homesteads, and that native peoples have begun to push the line of colonization, once Spanish, now Mexican, back. And so that brings us to 1846, rather, and the Mexican-American War. Although the storming of Chapultepec Castle, probably from the year 1848. Again, I want to say, right, kind of a war of conquest. I really don't want to. I'm very cautious not to sort of naturalize the acquisition of territory by the United States in this war by looking at sort of geopolitical factors. And I think the best way to do that, right, is to remember that where this border was going to be drawn was not predetermined. It was, in fact, the result of negotiations. And here we're looking at an old daguerreotype on the left of Nicholas Trist, who is an attorney, worked in Washington, and happened to be the one who was asked to go and negotiate the treaty in Mexico with Mexican authorities. And then on the right, we have Manuel de la Peña y Peña, who exercised various positions of power within the Mexican government during this treaty negotiation period, including president, Supreme Court justice, and Secretary of Foreign Relations. Like all kind of 19th century Mexican federal politics, the career of Peña Peña is complicated. And of course, you'll probably recognize the name of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who was, in fact, the Mexican president when these negotiations began. So what's interesting is we have accounts, although imperfect accounts from both sides about these negotiations, right? So we have a series of letters exchanged between Nicholas Trist here on the left and James Buchanan, who, of course, is a future president, but then is Secretary of State at this moment. We also have an account from the Mexican side of early negotiations between Trist, the American General Winfield Scott, and a group of Mexican commissioners that have been appointed by Santa Anna. Um, so again, the Mexican presidency in this moment is complex. I won't get into it. But what I do want to say is, so again, we looking at these sources, you know, Buchanan has Buchanan sort of writing Trist about his like his desires for what this treaty will bring about. Trist himself is very cognizant of the fact that Buchanan and Polk are quite unhappy with him at this point. Um, so he seems like he's trying to preserve his job in certain ways. Buchanan is accusing him of overstepping his authority. Trist is sort of walking it back. I mean, the sort of both interlocutors in this document have sort of reasons to represent themselves in particular ways, right, and not kind of in with total transparency. So similarly from the Mexican side, I think the document that we see is a kind of testament, perhaps to the national pride of Santa Anna, perhaps to the national pride of the negotiators. What we see is a strong series of demands, sort of articulated strongly, right? And a continual threat of renewed military action, and bear in mind, right at this point, U.S. troops are occupying Mexico City. Further military action on the part of Mexico is quite unlikely. But again, right, trying to kind of a rhetorical document. But I think what we can get from these is, the initial demands of each side, right, the sort of the ideal that each of the negotiating parties would want. And so we'll start with the United States. Buchanan says this is he gives certain instructions to Trist. He likes to say that none of this is sine qua non. He loves his Latin. Um, but right, so he's expressing what he says is like none of this is non-negotiable, right? These things are in fact negotiable, giving Trist a little bit of leeway. But what Buchanan asked for is a border from the mouth of the Rio Grande, going directly west to the Gulf of California. Um, right. So American acquisition would be all of that, including Baja California and of course, Alta or Upper California. Um, it's an enormous, enormous chunk of Mexico, right? Like, um, perhaps only adding, sorry about that, only adding, maybe 30 or 40% to the territory. But, and this is, I think is critical. The population in this area further south just dwarfs the population in the area further to the north of what was the Presidial line. So, it's interesting that Buchanan even asked for this. If we go and look at sort of Senate debates ratifying the treaty and debates about the war and what the result of the war might be, you see a lot of reluctance that is couched in, frankly, pretty racist terms, to bring large numbers of the Mexican citizenry into the fold in the United States. I think a lot of the scholars that I've encountered writing about this in the past have really focused on the racism of all this, and it's important to point out. It's kind of disturbing, kind of stomach turning at certain points. But I think another thing, and for our purposes here to really focus on is that this consideration was about bringing large groups of people that could potentially exercise significant amounts of political power into a democracy. And if we look at some of the things that happened after the war, in many cases the groups of Hispanics in what became the United States did just that, right? And so there's unrest, of course, in New Mexico, the Taos Revolt in the early 1850s. There's continued sort of unrest and rebellion and new republics and revolution in the Rio Grande Valley in sort of southwestern Texas. So we'll go then to the desires of the Mexican negotiators, right? And so what the Mexican negotiators wanted was, I should mention that the map that we're looking at is actually the map that was used to negotiate the treaty. Um, so the Mexican negotiators wanted the border of Texas to be, rather than at the Rio Grande, at the Nueces River, which would be significantly to the east. They wanted all of New Mexico to remain part of Mexico, and they wanted all of Alta Upper California, south of San Francisco Bay, to remain part of Mexico as well. And so, I want to point to the fact that there's significant territorial concessions in this, much smaller than what ended up happening. But it, I think, illustrates the main concern, and you can actually read this in the documents as well. The primary concern of the Mexican negotiators was not land or territory; it was people. It was the Mexican people. I will note, like, much less so indigenous people, right? But sort of Mexican citizens. And you look at the initial demands, um, that using San Francisco Bay, for example, as a sort of line north of which the territory would become the United States, means that the major population centers at that moment of Los Angeles and Monterrey and San Diego all would remain within Mexico, right? New Mexico, of course, and the Rio Grande corridor is also somewhat thickly settled, more thickly settled, I should note, than Texas or California. And again, that space between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande in Texas, that Southern Valley, settled then as now with, you know, uh, well, a lot of agriculture was happening at that moment. It was settled by Mexican people, right? Still largely a very Mexican area, still an area where a lot of agriculture is occurring, right? Um, so really, like, the thing is, it's population, right? It's population, and that's what's sort of determining these negotiations. And right, there's a wide breadth between them. Um, that is the American desire and the Mexican desire. So let's go. Sorry about that. To this close up, again, for you Arizonans, let's look at this. To look at where the border was actually drawn. And I think, you all probably have, a very good idea of where the border is, right? But it follows the Rio Grande roughly to El Paso, it then cuts to the west and to the north, and meets, and sorry, so I should maybe explain this, right? Because this is before the Gadsden Purchase. It cuts to the west and the north, the west first, and then to the northwest, and meets the Gila River, where it follows the Gila to the Gulf of California. Um, so again, this is right. This is the map that's used for the treaty negotiation, and I just want to. I mean, this is you know, maybe a little. I'll say far from conclusive. If you look at this particular map, you see labeled directly, clearly north of what would become the border of the Gila River, Apacheria, right? You see, on this Texas border, kind of other indications, this range of the Comanches, of sort of autonomous indigenous space, right? Again, kind of harkening back to this idea of the presidial line, right? So I'll say that there are, and I hope you followed me. I'll give a little summary here, right? Which is just the idea that what happened during the Visita General with Jose de Galvez and the Marquis de Rubi, right, resulting in this new plan for a line of presidios, effectively halts Spanish colonization at an area that is roughly contiguous to the U.S. border. Then when we move forward in time to the negotiations for the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, what we see is an overwhelming concern on the part of Mexico to keep its population part of Mexico. And I think what we can see is that they actually had some success of that, right? Right. I don't want to write off the tens of thousands of Mexican citizens, right, that were north of this line that had to deal with a whole different kind of future. And there's, of course, been a lot of wonderful historical work done on that. But as opposed to the early American demands, what you see, coming out of these negotiations in the end, when both parties finally agree, is a kind of is a line that closely matches this line that from roughly a century ago, right, the Spanish had determined would be a kind of border to their colonization efforts. So these have a strong relationship, right? And I'll say that there's two aspects to this argument, and I think each of them are important, right? And the first is that this fateful decision by Spanish administrators to halt colonization and create a line of militarized communities on the northern frontier had a huge impact on the geopolitics of the 19th century that followed, and then, of course, extending into the geopolitics of today. Um, but the second requires us to think about who all the agents were in this fateful decision in the late colonial era. And so I'll say Galvez, after all, had gone to Sonora with the idea of subduing the North and pushing colonization further. And in this, he failed, right? Um, those that succeeded in this confrontation, if only perhaps fleetingly, right, were a mix of ethnicities that shared a variety of relationships with the colonial regime. And again, right, these weren't all sort of nomadic or semi-nomadic Apaches. A lot of people that had been sort of missionized, a lot of people making choices to sort of move in and out of the colonial sphere to offer resistance here and there, right? To preserve their right to live in their sacred lands, to preserve their right to practice their own religion outside of the missions, to preserve their autonomy, right? Their way of life and their culture. And these people are not an aside to history. I think we can tell that story, and we can tell that story convincingly, right? About their resistance in the colonial era and the complexity of it. Um, but I also think they drove this decision by Spanish colonial administrators that then in turn led to the establishment of the border where it is today. So, right, rather than being an aside to history, these people are integral players, right, whose dogged insistence on autonomy and dignity shape the world we live in today. And so I will leave you with just a picture from 1895 of a group of Seri, the Seri among the groups that frustrated Jose de Galvez. Um, they're an interesting people in the sense that they had a very small population and a very small territory, but again, this huge impact, So uh, let's just we could just look at them, and with that, I'll conclude. And so thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Myers. So a couple of questions. What's so fascinating about what you've presented is you've got these two like really important but seemingly opposed lenses, if you will, for viewing this story, right? You've got biographical, the experience of an individual, and then you've got these larger global connections, right? Like of course, these are men who are trained with Enlightenment principles, even if maybe they're not enlightened like we would maybe define today. So a couple of the questions that are coming in kind of are thinking about those kind of global history connections. So this particular question asker has kind of singled out the siege of Havana in 1762, but I guess we can kind of expand it to thinking about, what is the impetus to send this inspector to check out what's going on in New Spain?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and whoever asked it and connected it to the siege of Havana is sharp. So I compliment them on making that connection. I mean, the interesting thing is Havana was an extremely wealthy and extremely important seaport for the Spanish, right? It's where the treasure galleons that departed the New World, right, bringing all the silver that came out of Mexico and Peru, departed and went across the Atlantic to Seville. So it was a place of extreme importance, extreme wealth. It was also really well fortified. And what ended up happening in the 7 Years' War is the British actually seized Havana somewhat easily. And so this to the Spanish was a real kind of wake up call that, for them to be competitive in this sort of new global military geopolitical matrix, right, they had to sort of modernize in really important ways. And so I think that's kind of the impetus. I mean, I should also say that Galvez is not the only visitador who goes out in this time, right? So this is a series of reforms, the Bourbon reforms, that are kind of aimed at all of the New World colonies, right? And that 7 Years' War and Spain's, to be frank, kind of humiliating loss in that conflict, including the loss of Havana, this important kind of capital in the New World, um, was really critical in triggering, the crown to commit these resources and some of their best people, and obviously a lot of money, to try to modernize their empire.
Yeah, that the establishment of kind of a Presidio line, I think, is really interesting to people when they see a map of New Spain and they see that it goes all the way up to essentially what is now the Pacific Northwest. But really, like, the Presidio at Tucson and a couple at California, like that's kind of it. And that's by no means the whole length of that land. So one of the other questions is, was there kind of like a phase two? Was there a plan to create a new viceroyalty? And then kind of related to that, how is how do the Spanish and then later how do Mexican governments kind of grapple with that space?
That's a great question. To the extent I maybe should have mentioned this a few more times, I didn't, because it kind of pushes back against my argument, unfortunately. But there was a kind of Spanish impetus towards colonization, at this time and after, and that was in California. The interesting thing about California is, I mean, I think Arizonans might know, right, of these kind of famed expeditions like that of De Anza, to try to connect, what is today Arizona with California over land, right? To connect Sonora and California. But that was always a kind of ongoing ambition. It was a really difficult thing. California was a colony of the sea, right? So California was supplied by ships. It was built around port cities. And so that extension of the sort of Spanish presence was, I mean, it's interesting because it's further north, and it shows an impetus towards further colonization and expansion of colonization, but it isn't really in this huge interior area that's proving so difficult. Again, right, sort of in the Mexican era, this whole region just continues to be sort of a problem, right? And it's a problem. I mean, that is certainly from the like colonial or state perspective. I mean, the fact is that it's not empty, and it's occupied by really powerful indigenous polities, right? So the Apache and the Comanche are kind of the big ones that come to mind early, right? That have access to weaponry through a kind of interesting trade on the Great Plains, right? They're starting to acquire in the early Mexican period arms and ammunition. They're certainly mounted at this point, right? And so you have groups of autonomous, free, indigenous people to essentially to the north of this line that are not only able to compete with the Spanish and Mexican militaries, but in some cases kind of dominate. In some cases, they're better armed. In some cases, they have better horses. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's like one of those things. I mean, I think this is far from the only example of a colonial map that paints an area a certain color and says this is Spain or this is the British Empire or whatever, where really that's not the reality on the ground. I hope that kind of addressed that question. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's one more that I think is kind of like a big overarching question, and our question asker will have to kind of forgive me for rephrasing a little bit, but this is the so what question, right? What does this mean? Why? Like, why? What is the legacy of the Spanish period? Why should we continue to study and care about this? And this person is kind of thinking specifically about what is kind of Spain doing with this legacy.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I tend to move away from Spain. I mean, I think that's my like as a kind of borderlands historian, um, most of my interest is kind of in, this place where I think many of you all and where I'm kind of sitting right now. And I'll say, right, the legacy beyond sort of the establishment of, and I hope I made this argument convincingly, right, beyond kind of being a kind of important factor in eventually locating the U.S. Mexico border, which plays into our daily lives. Those of us who live in the region, I mean, all the time, right, is a huge, like, hugely important thing. Right. This also shows the sort of power and influence that indigenous people played in this region going way back. Um, I mean, I think for Spain, yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting, right? This is it's an illustration of kind of weakness in some ways, but as another scholar pointed out to me at one point, all empires have edges, right? And
Mm.
there's a certain sense maybe that a high level of resistance from the indigenous peoples in an area, combined with something like aridity, right, and difficult topography, all of which kind of define this sort of Arizona, New Mexico borderlands region. Um, and in a certain sense, the sort of Texas borderlands, although that's its own thing. um it's sort of a natural place to stop and to say, this might not be worth our efforts. I mean, I think what's interesting about this story is that in this case, really, Galvez really did have a strong desire to actually extend colonization, like further north, and further develop northern Sonora, right, which is southern Arizona. And it turns out for very good reason, right? He was very interested in the mining riches, and anybody who's familiar with Arizona history knows that, in fact, they were absolutely there. Um, yeah, so I mean, I don't know. It's kind of interesting to me. We could look at you can look at this from various scales, right? And you could say this is obviously the late colonial period, and maybe the Bourbon reforms are a kind of indication of colonial power waning. Maybe Galvez's failure, right, to achieve the military success he wants in the North is an example of like New Spain losing power. But right, this is also a moment at the sort of turn of the 19th century. I mean, it's interesting, if you keep track of these dates, right? Like 1772 is the establishment of this line. Well, 4 years later, something really interesting happens on the Atlantic coast of North America, right? This is the same period. So, really, you really see this is sort of the age of revolution. So there's a kind of global phenomenon happening in which, European colonies are rising up and sort of demanding their independence. But then there are also these kind of more regional phenomenon, right? You can look at New Spain, you can look at Sonora, you can bring it all the way down. Um, so I think that's a kind of I think I did a terrible job of answering that question, but it's because it's a really good question and it's really hard to answer.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Myers, for being with us today, and thank y'all in the audience for joining us. I think that this, of course, I've hosted all of these series, so the connections between all of the different kind of viewpoints of this time period in history is really fascinating. So thank you so much for your time today, and have a good rest of your day, y'all.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming and listening.
Bye.